Backlash, WrestleMania's little brother, the most overlooked pay-per-view in WWE history. But just because you might be hard-pressed to find anyone who says that Backlash is their own personal favorite, that doesn't mean that there aren't still some excellent matches that have occurred throughout Backlash history, because there are. And those matches are the topic of this episode. Because today... Thank you to all my Patreon supporters such as Dakari Garman and Rodney Harris. You really help to keep this channel going. Thank you. Okay, so before we get into the list, allow me to ask that you please help support this channel by making sure that you're subscribed and by giving this video a big like. And if you want to show some additional support, then consider going over to my Patreon page and signing up. Anyway, with that being said, I really do appreciate all of it, and now let's get into my favorite Backlash matches of all time. We start this list off appropriately enough with Stone Cold Steve Austin versus The Rock for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship with Shane McMahon as the special guest referee. Now, this took place in 1999, which was right after their epic WrestleMania 15 bout. And what's fitting about this is that this was the very first Backlash pay-per-view ever. And not only that, but it was also no holds barred, and it lived up to that completely, as this was Attitude Era car crash wrestling at its absolute finest, featuring one of my favorite spots ever of Austin giving The Rock the stunner while he was holding a camera. Of course, it's very obvious that this wasn't one of the good cameras they were using for this stunt. We now go on to Chris Benoit versus Kurt Angle and their ultimate submission match in 2001. Now, if you know my taste in wrestling, you shouldn't be surprised to see this match on this list, as Chris Benoit and Kurt Angle are two of my absolute favorite wrestlers of all time, and combined they're one of my favorite matchups ever. Not only that, but I'm a huge fan of submission-based wrestling too, so when you put all these factors together, of course this match was going to be on this list. This was technical grappling-based wrestling at its absolute finest, accented by the fact that it was an Iron Man match where you could only win by submission, which makes it even cooler. And so, if you're a fan of this type of wrestling, you should definitely give this match a watch, or rewatch. Either way, you're in for a good time. Following the previous entry in 2002, we have Eddie Guerrero versus Rob Van Dam for the WWF Intercontinental Championship. Naturally, these two wrestlers are really gifted in the ring, but on top of that, they're also great at taking to the sky as well. And so, when you take a match like this and put the WWF Intercontinental Championship on the line, as well as having it be a match that's a battle of the frog splashes, there's no way this couldn't be anything but spectacular. Although, don't think we're done with Eddie Guerrero yet, because we still have more to go. But that leads me to... Team Angle, the world's greatest tag team, Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas are two of my absolute favorites when it comes to tag team wrestling. And for this match in 2003, they went against another one of my favorite tag teams, the Guerreros. And they did so for the WWF Tag Team Championship. Not only are all these men great professional wrestlers, but there's also a lot of great amateur wrestling backgrounds in this bout as well. And for me, I tend to be a sucker for that whenever we can bring it to the pros. Also, when tag team wrestling is done right, it can be a fantastic sight to see. And with these teams, of course you were going to get a match that was exactly that. And if you too are also a Shelton Benjamin fan, well, don't worry, because just like Eddie, we will be seeing him more than once on this list. And now, returning to singles wrestling in 2003, we have Brock Lesnar versus John Cena for the WWE Championship. Back then, this is when Brock Lesnar was at his absolute best, in my opinion. Not only that, but we also had John Cena, who was finally breaking into his own. And additionally, at this time, I myself would also say that John Cena was at his best too. Further still, back in 2003, the Brock and Cena rivalry was really intense, and I absolutely loved all of it, as I never thought I could ever get enough of this. Little did I realize that all these years later, I would discover that there is such a thing as too much Brock Lesnar, something that he managed to accomplish somehow as a part-timer. And now we're back to Shelton Benjamin as he takes on Chris Jericho for the Intercontinental title in 2005. What can I say? I just love me some IC title bouts. And the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla is one of the best that the division ever had. And as good as Shelton is in tag team wrestling, he was also right at home for the Intercontinental Championship division as well. And so naturally, when you stick these two together, they were going to put on one heck of a match. But if you like this bout and you've been digging everything I've been mentioning so far, well, the next match in 2006 should also be right up your alley as well. Especially considering that it features two wrestlers that have already made this list so far. Yeah, I have something of a pattern here. If RVD wrestling for the Intercontinental title is good, and Shelton Benjamin also wrestling for the Intercontinental title is good too, then naturally both of them wrestling each other for the IC strap has to be great, which is exactly what they did in 2006. But on top of that, not only were they wrestling for the IC title, but the Money in the Bank contract, which Rob Van Dam had, was also on the line too. Now, Mr. Pay-Per-View would of course walk away with the win for this one, even though he would just end up dropping the Intercontinental title right back to Shelton just a little while later. But nevertheless, when it comes to Backlash matches, this happens to be one of the very best. Another pairing that I think always put on a fantastic set of matches was Chris Benoit and MVP, and these two would wrestle at Backlash 2007 for the WWE United States title. Now understandably, with WWE not talking about Benoit and only recently beginning to talk about MVP again now that he's back with the company, this is a pairing that really doesn't get shown too much on the highlight reels, even though they should. Even though this match between Dolph Ziggler and The Miz for the Intercontinental title at Backlash isn't quite as good as their match at No Mercy, that doesn't mean that it still isn't very, very good, because it absolutely is. Now personally, I think that Dolph Ziggler brings out the very best in The Miz, especially as a technical performer, and I would even venture to say that he does a better job of this than Daniel Bryan, which is very high praise indeed. Okay, so before we get into the most recent entry on this list, I do have a few matches that I want to give a quick shout out to. While they might not be the most outstanding matches of all time, I do feel that they deserve a little bit of attention. So let's just do that. First up is The Rock vs. Goldberg, also in 2003. While this was not a technical marvel, it was a fantastic showing of storytelling, with The Rock really carrying Goldberg and getting him over like a big deal for his debut in the company. Now sure, The Rock was just copying the Hogan format, but what are you gonna do? It works for Goldberg. But he did manage to put his own spin on it. Next, we go all the way to 2009 with Chris Jericho versus Ricky Steamboat, a match that shows just how good Ricky Steamboat was, seeing he could still go even at his age back then. Hey, I'm willing to bet he might even be able to go now. And another thing to keep in mind about this particular Backlash is that it would be the last Backlash until 2016. And lastly, we have The Miz versus Seth Rollins for the Intercontinental title in 2018. Now, I was there live, and while this match is very good, it's primarily on here because the entirety of the card after this match was terrible, especially the main event. Okay, so the last match I'm going to bring up here is Kevin Owens versus AJ Styles for the United States Championship in 2017. KO had just won the US strap from Chris Jericho on an episode of SmackDown, which happened after the two of them went at it at WrestleMania. But not only that, while Kevin Owens would retain the title at Backlash, his title reign would eventually come to an end after AJ Styles defeated him at a house show in New York City, New York, which rumor has it was not intentional. But nevertheless, sandwiched in between these two really interesting events, Kevin Owens and AJ Styles had one outstanding match with each other, even though it did end on a countout. And so, while we might not have been able to see AJ Styles win it at that house show, we can still at least catch this match at Backlash. Well, there you go, my own personal favorite Backlash matches of all time. But what are some of yours? Let me know down in the comments, and please, once again, make sure that you're subscribed to this channel and give this video a big like. And while we're at it, thank you to all my awesome Patreon supporters out there. And as always, Dave knows.